Land expropriation without compensation dominated discussions at the University of South Africa today. A heated seminar on the issue was organized in response to calls by Parliament for public submissions on the land debate. The scope of the seminar focused on property rights as made out in sections 25 and 36 of the South African Constitution. The Democratic Alliance head of policy, Gwen Ngwenya, says land expropriation without compensation will lead to instability in the financial sector, while leader of the Congress of the People, Mosiuoa Lekota, warns against actions that could lead to war if the complex issue of land is not dealt with sensibly. Meanwhile, political analyst Professor Sipho Seepe says the land issue should be looked at in the context of apartheid and the failed CODESA negotiations.
We will not have a post-land conquer constitution as a proposition of discussion. That constitution becomes possible after land reconquest. So we need a revolutionary program, not a discussion around a new constitution. We know the amendment of the constitution is not going to be the end and not give us land. But we support this proposition because our people believe in the constitution. So we must exhaust the constitutional process. BLF are proud constitutional delinquents.
When in 1994 we went to the negotiations, we prevailed. The whites went to negotiate, not because they liked, we had prevailed. And we believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. We therefore resolve that we adopted this constitution in order to heal the divisions of the past. That's what we are busy doing now. And we are not going to allow anybody to disrupt that process by causing war in this country.
The Land Act of 1913, amongst other things, changed the socio-economic conditions of Africans. And this was also confirmed by Sam Peter Branch in his History of Inequalities in South Africa, that the damage the Land Act of 1913 has caused was to take away the independence of Africans economically.
Now, Professor Sipho Seepe, political analyst, joins us live in studio, as well as Cornelius Rasiobi, COPE Youth Movement leader. Gentlemen, good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. A rather heated discussion this afternoon. I mean, land is a hot topic right now in South Africa. Let's start with you, Prof. You spoke about this land matter in the context of apartheid and the failed CODESA negotiations. Let's give us some more clarity there, why you took it there.
Yeah, well, the first thing that we need to understand is the historical compromise around a historical injustice. And we should understand that those who compromised didn't go there because they wanted to compromise. There was a stalemate. The balance of forces dictated that you'll come out with the type of constitution that you have. Because what the liberation movements had been able to do was to make South Africa ungovernable and apartheid unworkable. So it became the interest of even of the white people to say, if we continue on this path, our future will be imposed on us. So it is important for us to enter into negotiations. So Tatel Lekota is correct to say the liberation movements can claim to have prevailed to that extent because you had people with state power. But at the same time, the liberation movement could not totally defeat the apartheid regime because it had control of the military, it had the control of the intelligence, it had control of the police. So those are the state repressive apparatus that could have caused mayhem. So the compromise was imposed by the objective and subjective condition. But it was always understood that moving from there, every space would be a terrain of engagement and of contest. But so the constitution must be seen in that context, that it is not what the liberation movements would have preferred, but it is conditions impose them to give in, as some people like the former leader of the Women's League and the late mother of the nation, Winnie Mandela, said that we may have over-negotiated, that what you are saying is that we may have actually gone too far. So that is the reality in which one was putting that. But what I was also trying to emphasize is that the constitutions exist as an instrument to resolve national challenges. And the constitutions, including our own, do expect to be amended when they fail to meet or to address those national challenges. So for the last 24 years, we have, the people have been forced to think as if the Constitution is sacrosanct. When I was saying the Constitution anticipates to be changed when it does not address the issue. Now, coming to the land question, the ANC adopted an approach that we know today has not worked. And the mere fact that in its resolution of December in Nasrec, that they talk about land expropriation without compensation, is because they've seen that even with compensation, it has not worked. So the notion that we should be radical is informed by experience, also the agency and the impatience by black people who see themselves as still trespassing in the country of their birth. So that is the context, and this is what the seminar was trying to do, was to try to bring the politicians and academics to participate in what is really a national challenge. Yeah,
I see one politician next to you nodding in agreement with what you're saying there, Mr. Rasiobi. Your leader, Ntate Lekota, was also speaking along the same lines, really just saying that healing the divisions of the past here is something that needs to be put out there and really acknowledged. And he also spoke about how it's really easy, it's convenient to be accused now as a sellout. What do you say to that?
We must clarify that the president is 100% on point. We acknowledge that the people of South Africa are in need of land. We acknowledge. But first and foremost, 24 years down the line, the African National Congress had a chance to give the people of South Africa land. There's very, very serious chunks of land that the ruling party is sitting on top of. And they cannot come today and say to us that land must be taken from people without compensation, while the Constitution clearly states that land should be expropriated with compensation. And there's a lot of things that are involved in this particular matter, that the African National Congress is actually trying to put us in a space where we end up fighting among ourselves while they are responsible for the whole mess. Let it be clear that the African National Congress, the ruling party, has failed the people of South Africa. Now the people of South Africa are taking it upon themselves to actually make it a point that they get the land they've been looking for. It's not like after 1994 there was no land. There was a lot of people who actually gave their land in much lesser prices, especially after the national elections. They gave their land at a much more reasonable price, whereby the government was in a position to acquire land from those that left the country during that time. Even if they've managed to acquire that land, they didn't redistribute. Guess what happened? They distributed the land among themselves. In actual fact, the issue of the African National Congress trying to say to us that we must actually take the land from the people, let them give us first the land they are sitting on top of. First, before we can talk about everybody else, the land that they are still sitting on top of, let them redistribute that land. And let me tell you the sad reality of what is going to happen when land expropriation happens. Thieves will be pouncing on top of that land. Look at Zimbabwe, what is happening in Zimbabwe. When land expropriation was happening, guess what? Grace owned the fattest farm with the fattest cows. Grace Mugabe.
Let me bring in Professor Sunukwane of Unisa into this conversation. Yes. Professor, we know that there's no democratic country that has had such a policy on land. What is your view on this land matter? I mean, we heard you also speaking at that debate.
Look, I think that South Africa, we are still left behind in terms of trying to make the constitution to speak to the demands of the people. One thing that we need to take into consideration is the fact that only a small group of people went into a room and negotiated the settlement. And that does not necessarily translate to the will and the wish of the people. Indeed, people will argue that it is democratic representation. Yet at the end of the day, the reality of the matter is that there was no proper consultation. But second to that, we need a policy on land, because where we are sitting now is the ticking time bomb. We've created what we call land hunger. ANC itself was formed on the basis of land hunger, and we've not fed that hunger. And if we allow this to continue forever and forever, we might find ourselves now dealing with the worst case scenario. And we've learned from other places that if we are not proactive, violence might become the only alternative.
Now, Professor Sepe, you spoke about the impact of this land matter in Zimbabwe, and how the country was brought to its knees and how the economy was bleeding. What should South Africa be doing differently?
I think what we are engaged in is a democratic engagement, which is actually necessary. We have Parliament, and Parliament has its own processes, but we also have civil society, we have political parties that engage within Parliament and outside Parliament. So we must actually value our own democracy, that it is a very vibrant democracy. But at the same time, we must also try to work within the law. This is why the approach that has been taken by the ANC and the EFF and other parties is to say, let us go through a parliamentary process. Let's have consultation with the people around this issue. So what do you have with the Parliamentary Constitutional Review Committee is to make sure that there are, road shows where there'll be broader engagement. But my input largely was to say, we must also understand that conditions have changed. We must not allow ourselves to be imprisoned by conditions that no longer exist. When we negotiated the Constitution, you had this particular, but the Constitution tells you what needs to happen for you to make those amends. So we are already embarking on what we should do in a democracy, a discussion. And what has happened today, what was beautiful, and with people like Professor Senokwane, is to say, let the academy not be bystanders. Let them also bring their own research, their own understanding. Let there be at least an engagement between the politicians and academic. And I thought it was, before there was disruption, the seminar went well. And most political parties were able to put their own understanding. But the whole thing is that unless we address the land issue, we are going to end up with the situation where people are going to be shot by the state because of land hunger. But what the ANC must also accept is also that for 24 years, their own policy of willing buyer, willing seller has not worked. So they must first own up to that. Maybe by accepting those resolutions in NASDAQ, it's a first attempt to do that. But they need to also explain, because those people who are involved with the land question in terms of the approach of restitution, they'll tell you how long it takes. And I must say, indicate here is that we're talking about land expropriation with compensation. It has the claims that were made on for the cutoff date of 1998. They will say with the current dispensation, it will take another 35 years to conclude them, even though the cutoff date was 1998. And the new claims, which are in number 160,000, it will take 143 years. So effectively, if when one were to go and do more of the same, it might take close to 180 years before we address what was intended by the very same Constitution. Hence, people are simply saying, let us look at the Constitution. And there are two views here. One view says, this Constitution as it stands does allow land expropriation without compensation, with the proviso that it is just and equitable. I mean, there are all those things. But there are others who are saying, if with compensation takes so long, using the Constitution, it will even be harder without compensation. So this is where the debate is. How can you, and the Constitution itself suggests that whatever solution we come up with, it must be just, it must be efficient, it must be economic. And this approach that the ANC had adopted in the last 24 years has been very costly, has been onerous, has also been litigious. So the amendments, if they are going to be made, should be amendments that lead to something that is just, that is efficient, effective, and economic.
Yeah, and government's inability to do land reform properly cannot be ignored. Yeah. And you are really passionate about it as COPE. I mean, you spoke out about what is brewing on the ground, what all of this could lead to if it's not dealt with sensibly. A really strong warning there from your leader this afternoon.
Yes, we must clarify that we are not saying, Congress of the People has never said people shouldn't get land. People must not misunderstand the president. He said he agrees that people are in need of land. But those that the land will be taken from, let them be compensated. That one we agree. In that particular sense, that means my challenge, the uttermost challenging challenge that we are having, the African National Congress, the ruling party, wants to take the land issue and in actual fact, make it a point that the land belongs to the state. Imagine now if the whole land belongs to the state. That means that now the land that I own, personally, that I bought, will belong to the state. The ruling party does not say that the land must be redistributed among the people and people should own land. We must interpret what they are saying clearly to the people of South Africa, because clearly people of South Africa do not understand what these guys are saying. They are actually saying, yes, we take the land from the minority, and then after taking the land, we redistribute the land, but above all, the state owns the land. Now, the people of South Africa must clearly understand what the state, that's why the African National Congress is celebrating over the land issue. And the second challenge that we must clarify is that, you know, there's so many things that are implicated in this thing. So many things. Right now, there has been, you know, there are claims that were made by Andile Mngitama about the EFF and the Comrade Julius Malema and intertwining with the ANC and whatnot. Everybody said, Mngitama is talking nonsense. He's just bitter because he has been kicked out. But in real fact, if you can sit down and check, everything that Mngitama said is coming to fruition. All of a sudden, they are talking about coalition. All of a sudden, they are talking about coming together. In actual fact, South Africa must understand that the economic freedom fighter and the African National Congress are one and the same thing. That is why today they are sitting here and they are talking about having meetings, talking about the issue of coming together. In fact, South Africans must understand that after the EFF and the ANC talk of coming together, that means that South Africa will have less opposition.
Let me bring in Professor Sunukwane. Professor, you spoke out during that debate saying that there must be motivation of some level of suspicion here. Of course, as Cornelius Rasobe is speaking, saying that, you know, this is rather vague. There is no clarity at the moment. And you've also motivated here to say that there must be some suspicion.
Look, it is very important whenever one deals with a theory, ideology, philosophy, or a text in this context, to be suspicious with it. Remember, when one moves from the premise that the document, the text, the theory and philosophy or ideology is innocent, then it's problematic. I think that's the problem that was committed even through the negotiations of CODESA. People assume that the intention itself was innocent in regard to the issue of negotiation of CODESA. But one realizes later that there is no innocence. You know, it's a book written by Alan Dusak that says farewell to innocence. The idea and understanding that I'm trying to propagate is to say to our members of the society, particularly blacks, to say we must say farewell to innocence, of thinking that things are deadly, things are innocent, they do not have meaning. You know, a text itself, if you take the Constitution, was written within a particular environment. But if you check the Constitution as a text, there is a world behind that particular text. You look behind that, there is the world of colonialism, there is world of slavery, there is world of imperialism, and there is world of apartheid that we need to look into. But above that, there is a world in front of the text, the world that wants us to look through a particular lens. And if we fail as people interrogating a text, fail to look into it suspiciously, meaning that we are suspicious that it might be the author himself or herself might have been biased or had a particular interest. Or to be suspicious of the fact that there is interest, we will be failing fundamentally in dealing with this particular clause, specifically Section 25 and 36. I'm saying when we read those clauses, we must open our ears and eyes and ask ourselves that maybe something went wrong. If you check, for example, the RDP document and the Ready Government document and Harare Conference Declaration, and you check the Constitution, there's been deviations from those particular policy conferences and documents of the ANC itself. Then one must be suspicious to ask, what happened? Why are we where we are? And for that particular purpose, one should even ask further to say, why compensation, yet this land, we are claiming that it was stolen?
But let me bring you into that. What would stop South Africa now from making the reforms on the Constitution in its current form?
No, I don't think there's anything that should stop South Africa from making reforms and making some gestures. I think a democratic country needs to do that. It needs to always go back to the drawing board. And the one that this Nugwan was also talking about are two things. That one, we must be suspicious in terms of the agenda. But what we must also try to do is to say what were also the assumptions. If you look at what Mandela said towards the end of his life, and what even people like Desmond Tutu were also saying, is that they assumed that given what black people had actually gone through, when they entered into a compromise, they expected that those who have benefited from their own oppression will also reach out. And that reaching out has not happened. Instead, what the ANC, there are two things that have happened. One is a failure to reach out, but there's also been incompetence on the side of the ANC to be able to make the changes that were required. It was the ANC that adopted a program or an advice from the World Bank on winning buyer, winning seller. That does not exist in the Constitution. So that's why I was saying the ANC itself must own up to its own political naivety. So there are those assumptions that must be addressed. There are issues of interest. It's the same way as even the BEE. It's the same as the TRC. The apartheid system affected the black people in general. You were affected not because you were shot or you were in prison, even when you were not in prison. But when we went through the Truth and Reconciliation, the beneficiaries of a system were not subjected to their benefiting on a system that was considered to be a crime against humanity. Instead, what we did was a parading of individuals, not systems. We are affected by system, but the system was not subjected. This is why I continue to say what the TRC and the Constitution did, among other things, was to lead to a compromise that in effect was almost saying black people must reconcile with the poverty. It was a legitimation of the condition with the promise that there'll be a progressive realization of improvement in your lives. But on the side of white people, they were told that you can keep your wealth. That wealth, and we didn't subject the business to the TRC, the business that was benefiting from the super exploitation of black people. We didn't subject the universities that were keeping black people out. We did not subject even the judiciary that had led to so many of our people dying in jails, in prison, and some of them denied. So there is a lot that was assumed. We assumed that because this was understood to be a crime against humanity, our counterparts will say, guys, you're forgiving us. We match it with this generosity, with finding each other. But today, Black people, as I say, they are still strangers in the country of their birth.
And talking about the country of our birth, the economy at this point is not something that's pleasing. We see how it's impacted thousands of workers' lives. But if you have to look at how this process will be measured, the economic impact, how will that be assessed ahead of the process really playing itself out?
Well, you need to make a case. I mean, you need to make a case for justice. Because, you see, there is a phrase that Martin Luther King put very nicely that says, those who make peaceful evolutions impossible make violent revolutions inevitable. We do not want to see violent revolution. So it's in the interest of both black and white to say, how do we begin to renegotiate in such a way that these stark realities of a perpetuation of what slavery and colonialism and apartheid did to black people does not consider. But we see right now young people who are almost outside, marginalized, already getting to the streets. And if we thought Marikana was bad, if we don't solve this, we'll have many Marikanas.
Your leader today said some people say our land was stolen, and a rather controversial statement there. What is your response to that?
We must clarify that, as the president has said, that there were fights, people were fighting for land. They managed to kill some, and some were killed from different races. And, you know, out of that, this is what we ended up with, the situation that we are sitting with today. But however, the solution to the whole situation is that, let's look at number one. What is it that South Africans need? Do they need farms? If a young person is given a farm in Limpopo, will he go to Limpopo and farm in Limpopo? That's a question.
Yeah.
Or most people that were given farms, especially black people, never used those farms. In actual fact, you gave them a farm, they resold the farm. Yeah. So in other words, it was better for them to have money than to have a farm. Yeah. But if we look at a place where we really come across land grabs, it's places, urban area places, where people are looking for jobs, where people are working, where people are actually struggling to find a place to stay. Is up. So I'm saying, in short, Mashodu a ruling party.
Thank you so much for that, gentlemen. Thank you for your time. Professor Boitumelo Senokwane was also live with us. Thank you for your time. We now go to a quick break. We'll be back with more news.